The following is a production of the University of Minnesota.
Thank you for being here today and welcome to today's seminar and workshop on Internationalizing the Academic Self, Teaching and Learning in International Higher Education with Professor Gavin Sanderson. Today we will be recording this session, and if you do not wish to be recorded, sit in the back of the room. But otherwise, the recording will be put up on the web for our colleagues who couldn't be with us today to enjoy and participate. The Office of International Programs and the Center for Teaching and Learning are sponsoring today's workshop. A portion of Gavin's visit has also been made possible by NAFSA, which is the Association of International Educators. I'm Gail Woodruff with the Office of International Programs, and it's really a delight to see so many of you here today, both in person and by UM Connect. We do have colleagues from the coordinate campuses who are joining us by UM Connect today. So hi Kim, hi Kendra, everyone on the coordinate campuses. Our goal is to continue to offer these types of professional development activities for you, the faculty and staff at the University of Minnesota. About 18 months ago, as my colleagues and I were starting to do our work of thinking of how to deepen the internationalization of the University of Minnesota, we started to more seriously undertake a review of the literature of international education. Our goal was to find models and methods and examples that spoke to our interest in providing more of these professional development types of activities for you, the faculty and staff of the university. Our graduate research assistant, Christine Parcells, I want to stand up, Christine, struck gold when she referred me to Gavin's 2008 article on the Journal of Studies in International Education on Internationalizing the Academic Self. Gavin's work really spoke to the concept that we knew was essential to our efforts to internationalize the university, that we needed to look at ourselves as intercultural beings. His work really reminded us that we needed to hold up that metaphorical mirror and look at ourselves and seriously ask ourselves, what is my international experience? Who am I interculturally? And how does that affect me as a teacher, mentor, and guide for students? We began to share Gavin's work widely as we launched more extensive efforts to internationalize the curriculum in campus. Everyone who attended our strategic planning retreat last summer was asked to read Gavin's article, and since then, Gavin's core messages have become key elements in our conceptual framework for internationalizing faculty and staff engagement. Essentially, Gavin Sanderson has had a fan club form here at the University of Minnesota, and I will be the head of that fan club. He's very humble, so I just embarrassed him. After I was introduced by Professor Joseph Mestenhauser to Gavin by email, we extended this invitation to Gavin to present both at the NAFSA conference, which is happening next week, and here at the University of Minnesota. And we were really delighted when Gavin agreed. Gavin arrived on Sunday evening, and yesterday he said it has felt like you've been here for a week, and I hope that's a good thing. But we have really already had great conversations with Gavin about the nature of teaching and learning in higher education and how this ever-evolving global landscape is really shaping the work that we do with our students. And we have all agreed that there will always be more work that we need to do in order to attend to that global learning of our students. Dr. Gavin Sanderson is Associate Professor and Deputy Director of Academic Learning Services at the University of South Australia in Adelaide. Over the past 3 decades, Gavin has worked at secondary and tertiary levels as a teacher, lecturer, and international student advisor. Since 1991, he has occupied internationalization roles at the University of Adelaide, Flinders University, and the University of South Australia. This includes the provision of academic and pastoral services to international students and assisting academic and professional staff that work with international students. Gavin is an inaugural member of the ISANA, International Education Association of Australia, and was president of that association in 1999 to 2001. His doctoral thesis examined the theoretical and practical pillars of a model of education from Western Europe that encouraged lecturers to develop certain knowledge, skills, and attitudes for teaching students from diverse cultural, language, and educational backgrounds. Gavin's research interests include globalization, internationalization, cosmopolitanism, existential issues in the internationalization of teaching in higher education, teaching international students, and learning and teaching in higher education. Gavin is the lead author and project co-leader for the Australian Learning and Teaching Council priority project titled Moderation for Fair Assessment in Transnational Learning and Teaching. The 2-year project had begun in October of 2008 and attracted funding of 220,000 Australian dollars. He is also the specialization coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in Education, which guides university teachers on the path to becoming better teachers at the University of South Australia. Gavin's publications include an evocative series of articles on the internationalization of the academic self, in addition to articles that address teaching international students. We're delighted to welcome Gavin Sanderson to Minnesota.
Thank you. Thank you. G'day. After all that. Thank you so much, Gail. I feel like I've known you for a long time. Really. And thanks so much, because I've been here for a short time, but I've got a feeling for the complexity of the size of it. It's a big place. The fantastic campus that it is, and I've only been to this, I'm either on the West Bank or the East Bank, I'm not quite sure. And also, I think just the opportunity to actually learn a lot myself. So thank you very much. And to also Mandy and Christine for your assistance, very kind. Thank you. Emeritus Professor Joseph Mestenhauser is in the audience, I think, and that makes me rather nervous. Joe and I met in Australia about 2 years ago, and knowing of Joe's work over the decades that he has been such an influential writer and thinker, it's a bit of a apprentice moment for me, so I'm really pleased that you're here. I'm also quite daunted by the fact that you're listening to what I have to say. So be kind, Joe. Right, the accent's okay, is that all right? Good, eh? You've got to understand that I come from Adelaide, and all of the other capital cities in Australia were settled out of a convict tradition. So when the British had their prison hulks full of prisoners in the Thames, and they said, "What do? We're getting more prisoners. Well, let's take them someplace that is far, far away." And so Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Hobart and Perth were all convict settlements. Adelaide is where the moneyed gentry went to live, to set up a utopia. And so we speak good English. The Queen's English. So look, one of the things about... Oh, by the way, hello to the folks who aren't here but are virtually here. I don't know where you are, how many of you there are, or what you can hear or see, but I hope that it's a productive session for you as well. Where to start? A funny thing happened to me on the way to Minnesota. I was in Los Angeles after flying on the A380 Super Jumbo from Melbourne, which is a big plane. It's a double-decker these days, and there's about 500 people on it. It's an awesome experience. I got to LA, and I was waiting for my flight to Minneapolis, and I saw a man with a dog in the airport, and I thought, it's not strange if it's what I call a guide dog, or a seeing eye dog. But this dog was a white dog with a big patch on its eye. It was a pig dog. That's what we call them at home. You call them a terrier or a staffy or something. It was the target dog, apparently. Does that ring a bell with you? So I thought, that's interesting. Who would do that to a dog? Like put a tattoo on its eye or whatever it was. And so when I turned up at my gate to get on the plane, the man with the dog was there, and I thought, that's interesting. And then the man with the dog went on the plane. I thought, that's interesting. And because they call it call business class passengers, please go on the plane. And the man with the dog went on the plane. So anyway, when they called coach to go on, I got on the plane, and as I walked through business class, and I think the airlines do this purposefully, business class is up the front for a reason. It's to remind us of the things we can't afford in life as we walk past. And when I walked past there's the dog sitting on one of the business class chairs. And it looked at me and I looked at him and it sort of said, what? You know, like, you know, this is just another day on a plane. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting cultural moment. Because how much does it cost to fly from LA to Minneapolis in business class? I don't know, $500? So obviously Target are making some money. But you know, like in Australia, yes, if you're sight impaired, you go to the airport with your dog, but the dog is in a cage underneath. You don't see the dog. People lead you onto the plane and seat you down. It was just a fantastic moment. It reminded me that our cultures and shared histories have similarities, but gee, there are some differences as well. And I'm reminded of that when I look at Hofstadter's work, which looks at cultural dimensions. And if you map out the American dimensions of culture and put Australia's on the top, there is no difference, ostensibly. But there are differences, ostensibly, aren't there? I've made a wiki, and the wiki is much more than the workshop will ever be. And it's a place that you can go to, and you can download resources. It's got many sort of topics and terms on it around internationalisation and teaching and learning. And I'd encourage you to, go there and have a look. Wikis are places you can actually add things as well. But in my experience of creating lots of wikis, probably only 3 people have ever added something to something I've done. But that's really not the point. It's a matter of how useful it is for you. So we'll talk about some things from the wiki today, but I won't be using it in particular as much. So please go there and take a look. I guess my work in particular is driven by my experience. I grew up in Broken Hill. I know you know where that is. It's 700 miles from Sydney, and it's in New South Wales, and it's in the desert, and it's a mining town. And does anyone else come from a mining town or a small town? No? Okay, well, if you come from a small town, you don't trust anyone else in the world because they want to come and steal what you have and all that sort of stuff. And so, growing up in Broken Hill, you're either an insider or you're an outsider, you're an A grouper or you're a B grouper, you're cultured or you're a barbarian, so to speak. And so, didn't realise it so much growing up, but we didn't really trust people from outside. And the town was 700 miles away in the desert, like it's a long way from anywhere. And so I guess just growing up with that small town mentality and then going to Adelaide, which is a city of 1 million people, which in Australia you call it a big country town. And I guess just having those horizons expanded by being a rural student. Now, sorry, the Australian consonant, the R comes from somewhere back here. Yeah, a rural student. A rural student. When I lived in Japan, I had to learn to speak like an American because the Japanese didn't want to learn Australian English. They wanted to learn American English because that's what they knew and that's what they heard on television. And so month by month, I gradually would say, instead of saying the word world, we live in a big world, I would have to say world. We live in a big world. And the students understood me. And I would come home and my wife would say, stop talking like an American and speak faster. I am not one of your students. So I guess the thing about having experiences as growing up in a small town and progressively just having that developmental experience of going places and meeting people, it either makes you more open to it or it closes you down completely. Okay, you either become so reinforced in your views of insularity and A-grouperness and insiderness, or you go the other way. And I guess there's a continuum there and you can be anywhere in between. And for me, going to Japan was the thing that exploded it all. Because if you want to go somewhere that's different, go to Japan. Like as far as daily life goes and values go, it turns it all on its head. To the point where the idea of culture shock becomes a lived experience. And so I guess today, and there'll be people in the audience who really resonate with this, a lot of it is driven by the personal experience, and the question is, how then do I convey these attitudes, dispositions, if you like? How do I convey them to someone who doesn't have that experience, you know? Now, I know in the US, study abroad is a really big thing, and when I read Gail's work around the OIP, or Office of International Programs, I get the sense that study abroad commands a place here, as it does in many American universities. But in Australia, it's so different, because our cultural other experience has come to Australia. We've got 26% international students in Australia. So more than 1 in 4 in every class, and it doesn't work like that, obviously. Some have 100% of students from other countries in them. But what we found is that the students hate that, and the staff hate that. And so we don't do that as much anymore. We actively engineer it, so to speak, so that we don't have classes full of Indian students, because they might as well be in India, really. So I guess the thing is, how do we impart these sort of views, if we think they're valuable, onto people who aren't as mobile and haven't had the experience? That's a fundamental question. How do you do that? And so we'll sort of work through some stuff today about identity and so on that might drive us towards thinking about where you are, okay? Because if it's about the internationalisation of the academic self, it's about where you might be, but also where our colleagues are. And I guess the whole thing revolves on the point of value. We think this is a good idea. And is it legitimate? Is it something we should force onto people? These are all questions that are interesting questions. I wanted to use a PowerPoint in particular, and I should also explain that my thinking about today is, I'll just tell you a joke in a second, is that I'll have a talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, if that's okay, and then you're going to have a talk amongst yourselves for at least half an hour. I've got some topics worked out that you have a selection. It's a smorgasbord today, and you have 8 topics. You've got to choose 2, and whether your working groups are 2 or 4, that would be great. But you've got to choose them and have a 15-minute discussion on each one. Then we're going to bring it back and have a listen to what people have to say about those things. The joke in Australia is that the president of the university is at a student function, and he says to the international students, "Oh, hello, I'm the president of the university. Have you come here today?" And the student says, "No, I've come here to study." Because what they heard was, "Have you come here to die?" To die. Once again, the consonants and vowels of the Australian accent. So when I say, this is what we're going to do to die, well, this is it. Okay, from the current slide. I have no idea of how long we've got here. It's 2:29, so if I go to around 3 o'clock-ish, okay. Globalisation and internationalisation are 2 key platforms, I think, that are worth thinking about. And I don't think people necessarily have to have the same understandings of those concepts, but they have to have an understanding of them. Because even in faculty publications to students and so on, I see the terms used interchangeably, and from where I stand, they're quite distinctive. And if we're giving students certain messages, I'd like them to have distinctive sort of impressions in their head about what's what as well. And it may come down to disciplinary differences as well, I appreciate that. But the work of Jane Knight, does that resonate with you? Everyone's, no idea? Okay, more people nodding. That's had a huge impact in Australia, massive. And it was sort of driven by, in 1988, the government said to the universities, of which there are about 39, it's a massive number, I know. 39 universities. You can bring international students here and you can charge them the full fee. And in a climate of economic rationalism and decreasing budgets, what do you think the universities did? It's a cash cow sort of mentality. And so in the first few years, we went into Asia and we showed our ineptness in some capacity by being financially gouging and insensitive and selling education as if it was a car. And in Asia, there are certain views on education which don't treat it like that. So we've learnt some lessons, and I like to think that because it's a journey, that's okay. You can make mistakes as long as you realise the mistakes you've made and then you change. If you don't change, well then that's a pretty sad story. So I'd like to think we've moved on quite a bit in the last, well, it's 22 years now. So universities could go into other countries and advertise their courses as such, their programs. And so Jane Knight's work was picked up pretty early in the piece, in the early 1990s. She was much appreciated. People really liked her work. And the reason is because it just was an explanation. It was a way to frame things. And so her definition, if you like, resonated with a lot of universities in Australia. And so when you went to the websites of the universities, they would just reiterate Jane Knight's view. Internationalisation is a process model. We take it as a transformative opportunity. Our rationale for engaging with this is this and this and this, and so on. So her work has had a big impact. And as Knight says, she sees a distinction between internationalisation and globalisation too. And one is that, you could say that internationalisation is as Rizvi says, it's an expression of globalisation. It's an agent of it, but also it's a response to it. It's a reaction to it. And if you look at Jane Knight's work closely, even though she says it's non-ideological, it's value neutral, it's not. It's founded on the spirit of internationalism, which is all about respecting other ways of thinking in the world and cultures and ideas. And so Jane Knight's idea of internationalisation is there's a black knight and it's called globalisation. And there's a white knight and it's called internationalisation. And we're going to work from below. All right? We may not be able to level the playing field, but we'll work from below and we will try and induce respect for cultural difference. We don't want a universal globalisation happening. We don't want people to lose their culture and their language. So her work's quite political, but it's not couched like that in any way whatsoever. And because she says it's value neutral, everyone walks around saying it's value neutral. That's okay. But I read the work of some people out of the UK in about 1999, and I really liked their framework for globalisation. They did an empirical study. They said, people are saying it's different now. Let's go and find out if it's different. And so they sort of researched ideas on economy, ideas on trade, ideas on movement of people. And they said, look, there are probably three ways to see globalisation at least. One is everything's changing. Hey, borders are disappearing. It's going to change the way we do things, and they're the hyper-globalists. And the sceptics said, look, it may look like everything's changing, but nothing's changing at all. And I like the phrase, it's old wine in new bottles. Okay, the hegemonies are there. It's the north-south divide, and so on. And so there are some people who aren't convinced it's changing at all, and it's just same old, same old. And then there are the transformationalists who are saying, yeah, some things are changing. And some things maybe aren't. And the other thing is we don't know where this is going. And that resonated with me, not just because Held sort of had the view, but I thought that's probably a fair thing. And in 1999 he said, we don't know where this is going. We don't know if it's going to result in a stronger nationalism or a more open view of the world. And then came 9/11 a few years later. And in the last 10 years or so, we've seen stronger nationalism, and we've seen borders closing down, and we've seen suspicion of cultural others. But I thought it was just like an interesting moment. Here's a book that's written to say, we don't know where it's going, it could go this way, it could go that way. Then something happens, and then you can start to see the trajectories. You don't know which way it's going to work out in the long term. So I like their work. I think it speaks quite nicely. Jane Knight's simple definition of internationalisation is sort of like embedding a international and intercultural perspectives into the teaching, research and service functions of a university. That's so simple. It's so nice. Okay, international perspectives, I can think what that might be. Intercultural perspectives, yeah, I can think what that might be. How does that look in a service capacity university, like in the refectory? Does refectory mean something here? Cafeteria? It's a weird word, isn't it? I don't even know why we use it, because even when I was a student, I'd say to my mum and dad, oh yeah, at university it's pretty good, we've got a refectory. And they'd say, what? What's that? I said, oh, like a food place, So I don't know, maybe it's English. Okay, So Jane Knight's work was really nice, and it made us think about what it means to have international students on campus, for example. Because if we're having Muslim students on campus, there's this thing about halal food, and there's this thing about prayer rooms, and there's this thing that on Friday they don't come because they're in the mosque. And so what does that mean for us in our teaching? Do we change anything, or do we just keep going the way we were? So they're fundamental sort of issues as well. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but Jane Knight's work basically talks about, if you like, the institution in particular, and she says there is a sector level and there is a national level, but where the rubber meets the road is in the institutions around internationalisation. And so everyone's going, like, yep, you're right, because we've got all these students here now. But what Jane Knight's work doesn't do is talk about the whole depth of the internationalisation dimension. And down the bottom, at the faculty and the individual level, is where the rubber meets the road. Because that's when the lecturers are coming to me saying, these international students are driving me crazy. I finish my lecture and all the Australians leave, and then the 55 international students descend on me and I can't get out of the lecture theatre for an hour. So, and marking work, what do I do when I mark work? Their English is not really great. They had to pass an English test to get in. It's about a TOEFL 570, IELTS 6 to 7, but somehow their grammar is not good. So do I mark precisely on that, or do I just look for the idea? If the idea is there, is that sufficient? So all these questions that make us think about who we are as teachers and make the institution think about what it is to be an institution in 2010. What sort of things do we need to embrace, and what sort of things we won't let go? These are interesting times. The literature bottomed out at Jane Knight's institution level. So Jane Knight would talk about, why are you in the game? Are you in it for a political reason or an economic reason? And now you can answer those questions, but then it didn't give any information about what happens in the classroom. Okay, what is it about an internationalised curriculum? What does that mean? There was no information out of Knight's theory, and simply because she didn't go there, it's not a failing of her work. She's focused on what she's focused on. So in the last few years, you'll see a bit of literature just start to generate. And around internationalisation of curriculum now, if you do a literature research, you'll probably come up with about 50 or 60 different things. And they're probably practitioners who are in their institutions who are saying, what is this thing? How does it work? What do we do? What are the outcomes of this? What's the scalability of this? Okay, so, and that's the sort of stuff that Gail has locked onto, and Christine's literature reviews as well. I want to give I want to back away from complex things, because life's complex enough, I think. This is not made to read. This is for later on if you wanted to look at it. But the strong and weak internationalisation is a nice continuum to work with. And there's a guy called Arjun Appadurai. Has anyone read his work at all? It's nice work. He's an eloquent man. I think he might be Sri Lankan, and he may live in the States. I think he might be at the University of Champaign, Illinois, maybe. And Arjun Appadurai says, if something is a weak approach to internationalisation, it's really just skating across the surface. It's not really engaging with the issues. It's looking like it might be interested, but there's no commitment as such. And at the other end of the continuum is strong internationalisation, which is contentious, which is laborious, which is challenging and difficult and expensive. And so I guess the thing is, with what you do at UM and with what we do at UniSA, I always ask the question of where does this sit on the continuum? And when does it get to the point where if it's hard, we just say it's too hard? Let's back away from that. Okay, so for us working with faculty around internationalising curriculum, when is that hard? And they're probably practitioners to go into. Well, that's just an open question, and they're things you can answer for yourself. But I like to think about British Airways' initiative about painting the tails of its planes, about a good representation of what strong and weak internationalisation might be. You see the picture there. Well, a little while ago, British Airways said, look, we're not just British Airways, we are everyone's airways. Look, we want to fly the world. We are your airline, okay? America, Australia, Cook Islands, Fiji, wherever. And so what they embarked on was a really nice initiative. They painted the tails of their planes with cultural motifs. I'm guessing that's a Canadian. It may. I don't know if that. It reminds me of something out of Vancouver, but that would be an Indigenous totem of some sort. Okay, that may be something where there's lace that's important. I don't know. An Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime motif. Any guesses? Well, I don't know. It's very nice though. Somewhere by the sea, dolphins and birds. That's nice. Probably a Pacific island somewhere, I'd say. Maybe Japan, maybe China. I'm not sure. Okay. Now, I guess the thing is, would that in itself be an example of strong or weak internationalisation? If it was just painting the plains of tales, which is very expensive, by the way, it costs millions of dollars. And I suppose you might say, well, if that was all it was, then maybe it's just it's like we like to look like we are involved, but we're not. But we've all flown. All of us in here have been on planes. What do you notice about airlines that internationalise? What do you see? Just yell it out.
Menu options.
Menu options. Yep. You can get Japanese food or whatever on a Japanese airline or a flight to Japan. Anything else?
Safety, multiple languages.
Well, yes. So the cabin crew have badges that have flags of the country on the world. It's either where they've travelled to or what they speak. I'm not quite sure. I think it's... Yeah, indeed.
Multilingual personnel.
Yes. Yeah.
And people from different countries.
Okay, exactly. What about movies? Music. Service. Okay, we're getting expensive now. We're just starting. It costs a lot of money to have sort of like a bilingual movie on the channel there. Okay, what about having pilots of your planes that aren't British? Making a commitment to to internationalise your workforce at that level, so that you have people other than Biggles flying you. I love getting on British Airways. I feel so sort of like I feel so safe when they. I can't even think of this English accent at the moment, but good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard this Qantas 747. We're flying to London today. And you feel like this person's flown for 1,000 years. I'm safe as house. This is really good. Okay, so you can see that a commitment to strong internationalisation for an airline is more than painting a plane's tail. It's really exploring a whole lot of things. And sometimes even if you have cabin crew in different places, that may not be a commitment to internationalisation, but more about economic rationalism. So Qantas wanted to have a lot of its cabin crew flying out of the UK as British citizens because it costs a lot less to have Australians flying to and fro. So when you get this continuum about strong and weak internationalisation, you can then sort of matrix it. And this is what Bartel did, who's a Canadian. In 2003, he published quite a sophisticated paper, I think. It was really good. Around his universities in Canada, it was a case study where he looked at a university that has a strong commitment to internationalisation from an internal perspective, and then looked at another one which had a weak commitment to it. And so he used Sporn's organisational typology to do that. And that's at the organisational level, but obviously there are things that happen in the organisation that get you to a point to say, we do this well, we make this commitment, and so on. That's a nice exercise to do. So I like the simple concepts, and I like you can build a matrix out of a simple concept, okay? Because when you talk with faculty, they're already busy. They're busy people who are working with their discipline, and the last thing they want to become is an expert on internationalisation, let alone learning and teaching. Okay? So you have to be gentle. You've got to be gentle. But this is the key, like you can talk about international sort of aspirations of an organisation, but the thing is, sorry, that was me. The thing is that it's only through the cumulative effect of strengths and works, of individuals, that an institution can say, we're solid in this area, okay? Because otherwise it's just like painting the tail of a plane. We've got fantastic policies, brilliant policies around internationalisation, and when you look inside the university you can't see much at all about the application and the lived experience. So from what I've seen and the conversations I've had, there is a sophistication around what UM does, and I know you're not near where you want to go, and neither are we. So even though we've been thinking about internationalisation for over 20 or 30 years at our university, actually that's a lie because we only came into being in 1990, so it can only be about 19 or 20 years. But in Australia generally, we don't have all the answers. That's something I should let you know. And there's some references at the end. This PowerPoint is available on the wiki if you want to make use of that at some point. Now, let me change this to something completely different, where I'm from. Do I want to see that one? How are we going for time? Gee whiz. Let me try and juxtapose this openness and ideas around plurality and interconnectedness and nice sort of internationalised themes and cosmopolitan themes. Let me talk about Australia a little bit. We're such an enigmatic country. On one hand, we welcome diversity in so many ways. On another hand, we eschew it. We don't want it at all. And that's the Anglo-Celtic framework of the country that really shines through. We are multiracial and monocultural, if that rings a bell. We've got, like the USA and Australia must be second and third to Israel as the most multicultural countries in the world. And the thing is that underpinning our framework is this English framework. You know, it's a British law system, it's a British education system, although the US has had a big impact in the last 15 or 20 years from university point of view. Let me talk about Australia through imagery. These are the nice statements by Edward Said and a gentleman in Australia, Michael Singh. I really like the Michael Singh quote because here it says is universities are pursuing a project of internationalising themselves, and there's an emerging politics of resentment in our country. So this is just a fascinating place to be. And so you have this tension. And when you talk about internationalisation and globalisation, you're talking about things that push and pull all the time. And there are tensions there all the time. And even if internationalisation is working sort of like as an agent of globalisation, it's simultaneously pushing against it as well, if the frame of reference there is pushing against it. But what I want to do is show you some cartoons, because cartoonists seem to capture the essence of political moments and social moments. And sometimes you look at them and they're funny, but gee, they tell a strong story, I reckon. There's a book I've got in Australia, and I chanced upon this as just a book of cartoons. I never thought about it until I sort of got into studying. Cartoonist images played an important role to remind us of our hatred of the Bungs, that's the indigenous Aboriginals, the Chows, mostly Chinese, the Japs, the Wogs. The Wogs are people from Italy and Greece. The Poms in particular, and migrants in general. And this is, you know, in 1983, so we're talking 25 years ago. I'll start this actually, so to give you the full slide. The people who are not here but are virtually here, are you doing okay? Just not... I hope you're doing okay, and I hope you're seeing this. Ben or Nate can tell me. Yeah, okay, good-o. What a good cartoon. What a good cartoon this is. By the way, you are the septics. I don't know if you know that. That's our Cockney English background, the septic tanks, the Yanks. Yeah? So you must feel pleased that you also are considered by Australians to be in with everyone else, which is very inclusive of us. Okay, there's an image. When Captain Cook arrived in Australia in 1770, there were Indigenous people on the shore who were inquisitive. And Cook stood on the poop deck, as one does, on the Endeavour, and he said, "There's no one here, we'll have it." And so it was called Terra Nullius. A place, an empty place. No one owns it. No one has it. Okay, and so it's a sad story. Our history with Indigenous culture in Australia, but there is a respect. And I read the 10 totem boards just out of the big football stadium you've got. And I guess I see a resurrection of the Indigenous tribes through legislation and their own independence. And that's happening in Australia as well. Our Indigenous population is only 2%. It's not very big. And so they have to be strong and they have to be supported to thrive. And so there was a view that Indigenous Australians, they were just keen to get on the drink and pretty useless at all. There were jokes made about a gin. A gin is a female Indigenous, or obviously an Indigenous woman. Gin and water, obviously a nice English drink, and there's a gin in the water. And so a stranger in their own land as European settlement took place, trying to assimilate in a sense. If you can picture the English women in their large dresses that flopped around. And so the early English settlers laughed at the Indigenous people's attempts to look like them. But then came the Chinese, the great gold rush. Chinese are very industrious people. They work really hard, they seek out opportunities, they have a long history and a long culture of travel. And when the Chinese came, the sense of threat that was around was palpable, and there were lots of nasty incidents that happened between the British/Australian miners and so on. But you'll see a theme start to emerge as I go through some cartoons here of Australia as being the innocent, childlike entity, and us just being slowly encroached upon by the cultural other, who was looming large through immigration in particular. And the worst thing would be to imagine a world in which we were subservient to the cultural other. Okay, that would be just the nastiest thing. Now, when I say this, you get where I'm at. I'm not saying it would be the nastiest thing, but I'm saying, I'm doing a bit of a narrative here. This is a pretty good one. That looks pretty scary to me. Okay, so if you're involved in, the Chinese were involved in robbery and drugs, and they brought in smallpox. They were immoral, cheap labour. And once again, to be subservient would be a pretty nasty sort of thing. A multicultural setting over Christmas dinner, unthinkable. And as we moved into the 1900s, our attention focused on the developing countries in Asia, particularly Japan, as its industrialisation developed. And its intentions became clear to go out around the world. There's a really, this will blow your mind. It was legal in Australia in the 30s and 40s. If someone came on a boat, if they were an immigrant, and they arrived in Australia, they had to do a language test when they came here. The person giving the language test could choose any language to be tested on. So this little caption under here is another alien. Couldn't we give him a test in Gaelic? So I'm blown away by that. Can you imagine that? You can't come in, okay? You speak English, but you don't speak German. That's just a weird thing. And so the imagery is quite strong. And when I run this workshop in Australia, this is you have things culturally that make you feel a little bit creepy inside. This is pretty strong stuff. And I was mentioning to Gail at the moment, we've got Tom Hanks' The Pacific. And that reminds us in Australia of how close the Japanese were to coming in and invading Australia. And that would have been the worst thing. I'll just step out of myself for a second. I'm an Indigenous person on the shores of Australia. I see a ship. There's someone coming into my country. That would be the worst thing. Okay, so I'm back in here. So I'm just trying to say that if you open yourself to the thinking of putting yourself in the shoes of others, then I think that sort of compassion and that plurality is a possibility. You start to, I guess, have a humbleness and a bit of you feel a bit lucky about where you are, the circumstance and so on. So the Japanese bombed Darwin. They killed 76 people or so. They sank ships in Sydney Harbour with their submarines. It was very close to home, you'd imagine. So when you see images like this, these portray the cultural other as a threat, obviously a threat. I'll just whip through these. So we are a continent, we are an island, the smallest continent and the largest island. And so for years we've been trying to keep people out. Years. It's only in the last 30 or so years that that sort of island mentality has changed a lot. And this is when I talk about the enigmatic nature of our country. We've been trying to keep people out for a long time. We have certain views of cultural others. We want to keep Australia as this mythology type idea of what it is. And I was in here. I was sort of like up in the middle in another town where everyone was standing around that town as well. So it was doubly insulated from everything outside. And yet in the last 20 or 30 years, our immigration program has brought in tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of people from all around the world. And that's benefited us in many ways. And you'd say even just going out and eating is not the stodgy English type food that people would associate with, like steak and 3 veg or something. The cuisine in Australia, like the cuisine in Minneapolis, I gather, is absolutely incredible. If it stops there, it's no good though. If we just like the food, that's not much chop. So as we move through the years, you've got Second World War, then you've got the unsettling times after the Second World War, the communist flow coming, people emigrating out of our post-war Europe, from Germany, from Italy, from Yugoslavia and from Greece. And this is a nice one. This is Gough Whitlam, who was a Prime Minister, who was a good Prime Minister in Australia. I like the thing there. We didn't account for a subtle cultural difference. They believe everything you say. And what Gough said was, come in. This is a disturbing photograph for me. 1966, well, so 40, 50 years ago. It's pretty savage stuff that's in your face. So we live with this. This is my favourite cartoon. When the Vietnamese boat people came to Australia after the war, this is sweet because they came unassisted and the Aboriginal people are meeting them saying, sorry mate, it's already been taken. And that was from James Cook and so on. And in the last few years we've had some very radical right-wing politicians. Pauline Hanson, you're forgiven for not knowing her. If you do, well. And you've probably got people in the States who are in a similar place. But just basically saying, we should ship out all the Asians in Australia. If they've been here for 3 generations, it doesn't matter. Sadly, our Prime Minister, George Bush's good friend, man of steel, John Howard, he took on a lot of Pauline Hanson's policies. He said on one hand, Pauline Hanson, you can't say that, you can't say those sorts of things. And when he got rid of her, he did those sorts of things. And I'll just sort of finish this particular excursion with, John Howard, we've got to have a look. This is an image that from the current slide. Okay, piss off. Don't come. I'll finish with that, but I want to really give you a picture of they're the things we struggle with as people who, I guess, are working in a university, which is quite a specialised place. It's quite an interesting place to work because if any connectedness is going to happen, it's probably going to be through a university or perhaps in business if it's done in a reciprocal, respectful, ethical sort of way. We're in a special place and we should make the most of that. The idea of thinking, having the luxury to think about issues to do with internationalisation and globalisation and our dispositions and what it means for us as people and our engagement with others, people often don't have a place to think like that. And as instrumental as our Australian universities are becoming, it's still a place where good thoughts and good thinking can take place, where we can debate the idea about international and global things. So I guess the thing is that, and perhaps America shares some of those sort of stories. You'd have your own slideshow, yeah? You'd have your own slideshow, yeah. And so when it comes to me being my ancestry is Scottish, I'm a privileged Anglo-Celtic Australian, if you like. My position is one of, I don't have to be thinking about plurality that much. I have enough privilege in my life to just sort of say, look, don't worry about that. I'll just get on with my life. And we were saying over dinner last night, you can live your life as a redneck yokel in Minneapolis or up in the sticks up north or whatever. And you can do that. You can have those attitudes and you can thrive you can thrive. But in terms of thinking about what's happening in the world and the way we're connected, even if we're not seemingly connected, we're connected, it would seem to make good sense to actually start to think about our place in the world, reflect on the values we hold, why we hold them, and then to see if difference is not so much difference, but what do we share that's common? These are interesting questions. So we talk about that in teaching and learning at our institution. We try and say to the faculty that, okay, the differences are obvious, but to focus on them would be counterproductive. What are the similarities here? What are the things that students want to do? All students come here to study. Some of them are sent here by their parents and don't like it in particular. But they will go home with a degree. They'll do what it takes, but they may not get involved as much. Other people want to jump into the pond of Australian culture and swim around in it and start to have an accent that sounds like I sound. And when you meet an international student who's been there for 4 or so years and they're talking and you pick up this Aussie twang, you think, wow, that sounds like one of us almost. That's really interesting. So we're almost done with time, and I guess the thing is it's not so much about any answers in the last hour, it's about sort of just raising the themes, and I think the themes are the things that if they're meaningful to you, you can focus on and carry forward. You can continue the conversations with this sort of stuff. A lot of our engagement with internationalisation is driven by international students, and that's because basically there are so many of them in Australia, and they come from mostly Asia and the subcontinent. And the US is represented as probably 9 out of 10 in terms of the numbers because of the Study Abroad initiative. We get lots of students from the United States coming out to Australia. And so cultural otherness is in our face in the university because we have such a big international student population. And for years and years we've been running workshops on teaching international students. And so in 2010, every time I run a workshop I'll get 50 people coming. Next year it'll be the same, another 50. And that's because they're new, right? There are people there who are new. Some have been told to come. Okay, that's fine. Others like teaching. They're passionate teachers and they're frustrated. And they just want to come to hear how they can lessen the frustration and be a better teacher perhaps, or to solve some of the student issues. And so that's another avenue into our workshops. But it's experiential. When I went to live in Japan, I learned some Japanese and I read a lot about Japan. Nothing prepared me for the first week in Japan. I was in the bush in Japan. If there's such a thing as the outback, I was there. Right? And when I'd say to people, they say, "Where do you live?" And I'd tell them and they'd say, "Well, you're way out there." This is Japanese. Inaka. Totemo inaka desu ne. Some of you probably speak Japanese, know what it means. It means you are way out there. Anyway, so I found myself living in the middle of a rice paddy in an apartment, or surrounded by a rice paddy. And when you have rice paddies, when there's water in there, you have lots of frogs. When you have lots of frogs, you have lots of snakes. And the cacophony of sound when I arrived in summer was unbearable. The heat and humidity was like something I've never experienced in my whole life. I come from a climate where it's like Los Angeles. And it's really sort of Mediterranean climate. That's what we call it. Like Greece and Italy then in that case. Boy, I was flattened. I was flattened in Japan and I could barely lie on my tatami mat and reach the telephone and say to my parents, "What have I done? I think I'm going to come home." So you can read about it, but until you do it, you don't know what it is. You can read about flying a plane. Sounds really good. Until you do it, you don't know what it's like. Until that instructor sits next to you and puts his full boot on the left rudder and induces the plane into a spin and says, "Okay, keep calm." And the plane's doing this, going towards the ocean from 3,000 feet. Listen to me, pull the control column to neutral, apply full opposite rudder, pull the control column back, and then the plane pulls out of the spin. And your heart's just going... I had a licence a long time ago now. So, it's experiential. And so when you're working with faculty who are either, talking with students who are going out from to study abroad opportunities, or students coming in to It's all experiential. You need people on the ground who have done it and who have an empathy and who can relate. And then you need to lead the other people to that space as well. And I know Mandy was telling me she took some faculty to New Zealand, and it's great. It's a wonderful thing. And my comment was that is a wonderful thing, but people can go to other countries as either frogs or snails, if you like. And let me explain a quick view of the president of our university and a trip he makes to Asia. A chauffeured limousine picks him up at home, takes him to the airport, he goes to the Qantas Club. Sits in the Qantas Club, very sort of special place, costs a lot of money. He gets flown business class to, let's say, Thailand. He gets picked up by a chauffeured limousine. He goes to the Meridian Hotel. He goes straight to the club floor. And he's sitting up there going, this is pretty good, like I'm in Thailand. I'll have a steak and chips for dinner, and I'll have a Budweiser for a chaser, And then he gets picked up in a chauffeured limousine, taken to all the functions in there. And so the thing is, you can travel like that. But every now and again, what happens, the thing is, if you go out onto the street and take a risk and say, I don't know what that thing is in that wok that person's cooking, but other people are buying it and it smells pretty good, so I'm going to go and have a go at that myself. Okay, so a lady called Anne Campbell had wrote a paper, a very small paper that had a big impact on me. It was about frogs and snails, and it says, the metaphor is you can dive into a culture and you can let it wash over you. And maybe it's not a great metaphor, but it's a metaphor. And you can sample it, and you can expand your horizons as a result of that. And it can make you think about what you believe, if you like. And gee, people do things differently here. Why do I do the things the way that I do? And is that different? I don't know. So I guess that's the thing, like leading staff to a point, faculty to a point, and staff, professional staff. The terminology has just floored me, I'm sorry. Faculty, academic staff. Professional staff in Australia are the people who are not faculty. They work to support all sorts of programs. They work in the international office. They support degree programs as well around administration and so on. How do we give them the opportunity if they're not mobile and they don't jump into the pond in another place? That's the question. And I know that UM's working on that, and we're working on that, and we have success and we have failures. But the thing is, we think it's important, so we keep moving forward with it. And we keep saying to our bosses, I know this is going to cost a bit of money, but we think it's pretty important. And that's our commitment to strong internationalisation. We want to do things that, it might look a bit crazy, but if you do something that suddenly becomes well known, especially throughout other institutions, then you're held up as a luminary, if you like. And I mentioned to a group this morning that famous saying, a prophet has no honour in their hometown. You can be the best person in your discipline and in your area, and yet it's people outside your institution who say, they're the person, that's them. All right? And you may face obstacles in your institution, even though you've got some great ideas, but that's just the way it is. You're in this institution and you have to work with that. And maybe you'll be famous by being someone who is regarded so highly outside your institution. That's the way you go. I don't know. I realise that I think there are a lot of differences between higher education in Australia and in the US. US is so big. We've gone to the UK because of our historical roots and because there are only 60 universities there. Okay, we speak the same language, all that sort of stuff. When we think of the US in Australia, it's this amorphous thing. And there are probably 5,000 universities. There might be 50,000 universities. Some of them are run by the state, others are private, there's lots of private. We have no idea what goes on here. And so we don't look for initiatives from the US because we can't find them. You know what I mean? We know what the ones from the UK are: widening participation, inclusive approaches to teaching. And we can lock on to those sorts of things. But what's happening here is probably state-based. I don't think there's any great federal control of the universities here about directions and aspirations and all the rest. I don't know. Okay, so now it's over to you. You've sat and listened, and I'm very grateful for that because I don't like necessarily being too didactic and transmissive. I'd like you to spend some energy for the next half an hour at least to work through some topics. And if you can do it as groups of 4, I think that would be good. And if you can't, then 2 is okay. You've got 8 topics to look through. And these are topics around internationalisation of the curriculum in particular. We could have talked all day about this. and all day tomorrow about this. And I haven't given too much around internationalisation of curriculum as such. The wiki's got a lot of stuff on it that might be useful. What I want you to do in your groups of 2 or 4 is to choose 2 of the 8 topics. Things that either interest you or don't interest you, and you'll have a challenge. Okay, so you've got 30 minutes, which means you've got 15 minutes on each topic to unpack what it says, and I've put 3 questions for each if you like, as a guide to help you, but you can ignore those if you like. Also, you might choose to do something of your own. You might choose one of the topics on the page, but you might think there is a pressing need around internationalisation at UM that's not made explicit in the topics, and you want to actually bring that up yourself. I'd encourage you to do that. And what I'd like to do after that is bring you back and have a chat. So it's 11 minutes past 3. We started 10 minutes late. I'm hoping it's okay here to finish 10 minutes late. In Australia I wouldn't do that. We're out on the dot. But you'll be gracious, won't you? So you've got half an hour from now. Someone be a timer. If you have no one, put your hand up and then go and be with that other person with their hand up. And I'll be quiet now.